So one of the most common problems that I remember running into is simply not understanding what's difficult when it comes to texture and shading. So I'm going to start you guys off good by giving you just a general roadmap so you guys can start with a good foundation. So before getting into all of this, I just want to kind of hit this hard. You do not have to be good at all of this stuff to be a good texturing artist. You only need, to know, the very, very basics, these two right here, to get really, really, really awesome results. And then if you feel like texturing is your thing and you want to really, really get good at it, that's when you would jump up and start doing, layered materials and hand painted materials. You can get, 80% of the results that are done in production are just right here. So first, just getting to know the levels of difficulty will save you a lot of headache. For me, I remember jumping from, trying to do hand painted stuff right off the bat and then going over to, this and that. And, if you just start with the basics and build up from there, the learning curve with all of texturing will be substantially easier. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. I would say the most common thing that I see is people, I'm very, very guilty of this, of just jumping straight into texture painting, in this case, a texture and paint tool inside of Blender, and immediately you start painting and thinking everything's kind of done this way. And that's definitely not the case. This is, painting things from scratch is going to be the most difficult thing. Unless you're doing like very, very basic, like Blizzardy and very stylized stuff, generally speaking, hand painting is going to be difficult. So where you want to start is going to be up here with tileable textures and doing things like modified and generated tileable textures. This is where for the most part, we're going to be doing the fundamentals. Layered materials is definitely more of an intermediate thing. And then hand painted is definitely more an advanced thing. We'll talk about each one of these as we go. So tileable textures. Tileable textures basically means is we have, a texture that we can repeat over and over on top of a surface. So we can scale it up and down. That's what tiling means. And basically the easiest way to start is just by utilizing online resources that generate this stuff for us. And because we're going to be starting by using that, we'll get a bird's eye view of what this stuff looks like so that when it becomes time for us to actually generate this stuff ourselves, it'll be substantially easier. We'll know the end result that we're looking for. For me, I went years just working with color maps. I didn't touch things like roughness mats for years, and my shaders always looked super flat, and I didn't really know why. So you guys are going to avoid a lot of that headache that I definitely started with. And you can see here, this is 3dtextures.me, and there's that texture right there, which we'll get into how to actually assemble all that. 3dtextures.me is a really, really good free resource. The one I would say I use most is textures.com. We'll talk about the pros and cons of this as well. Polygon.com is also a really good resource. We'll talk about the pros and cons of all these. So modified tileable textures. What do we mean by modified tileable textures? A modified tileable texture is something like this. It doesn't necessarily have to be tileable. I'm going to leave it there. But what I mean by modified textures is basically we have something that we grab from an online resource and we need to modify it a little bit. Specifically this book, for example, that we're going to get into. The edges right there, the photo itself doesn't show the underlying bits and pieces of it. So we have to actually sew that on in order to be able to put that into our 3D object. It's really, really common image editing techniques like that you have to get into, specifically doing those kind of things in like a program like Photoshop. We're not going to get into that at all in this course. We're going to stick with doing things inside of Blender, but we will be going over some examples along the way so you guys are at least aware of what you should be using those Photoshop image editing types of software, what kind of things you should be doing with them. Generated tileable textures, what does that mean? What I mean by generated is basically we start with a single texture and then we generate our roughness, our bumps, and all those maps utilizing a single texture. And I would say this is how I start most of the time, just because most online libraries haven't been built out to include this kind of stuff. With every single one of the textures, it's very, very common just to find a texture and then you generate this and then that's how you get the material. So we'll be getting really, really deep into this as well. The first way we're going to talk about is just simply grabbing all the maps from an online resource and generating from that. And then we'll get into actually generating from a single texture maps that we can then utilize with our texture. We're going to be primarily sticking with Blender. And there's two other packages I do want to mention in here that are also really, really great that you don't have to use, but are good additions with this. One's going to be, which is like a texturing package dedicated to just creating tileable textures from images It's super powerful. You can get some really amazing results with not a lot of work in there at all. Next up is going to be Substance Designer. So Substance Designer is going to be more of a node-based approach. This is definitely more of an advanced tool. So I wouldn't start here. I would, get your feet wet in Alchemist and then jump into there. So layered materials, what do we mean by that? Layered materials look something like this, is when you have a, here we got the snow material, here we got this ice material, and then we have a mask to blend between them. So this is going to be the key piece right here. We're going to be learning how to do this. We're going to be learning how to do this. We're not going to get much into this because this is more of an intermediate thing. We're going to do a little bit of it, but definitely more intermediate. And we do have courses planned to be able to cover this kind of stuff. So you basically use things like ambient occlusion, curvature, then you generate a mask, and then you use this mask to layer in materials, getting really, really complicated results like this. You can do layered materials really, really well inside of Blender. Another really, really popular, I would say the most popular package to do this in is Substance Painter. And if there's one package I would recommend getting into outside of Blender for doing texturing, is going to be 100% Substance Painter. I would pick this up, I would say Substance Alchemist would be a good beginner tool. And then jumping into Substance Painter would be a huge addition to that. The benefits of Substance Painter is that it's really, really good at 3D painting, but it's also combining 3D painting with like a Photoshop layered stack for doing things like multi-layered surfaces. So you can blend metals and rust and grime and all that kind of stuff very, very quickly and easily all in one package. And the last one we'll talk about is just hand painted textures. So we are going to get into a little bit of this in this course just with our candle. But for the most part, this is going to be more of an advanced tool. We're not going to get much into it in this fundamentals course. Blender can do them really well. Substance Painter, the best one is going to be definitely Mari. You can get the free non-commercial version of this, just like Nuke. They're both made by the Foundry. It's really, really, it excels at doing characters, creatures, things like that. So things like characters and creatures are going to be the most complicated stuff to texture. If you want to get good at this kind of stuff, you really have to specialize in it to get good at it. And to kind of reiterate this one more time, we're going to be focusing primarily on tile-level textures and then modified generated tile-level textures. And I'll be giving you guys some direction on the pros and cons of different workflows, and what Blender is going to be really good at, what you might want to consider doing elsewhere. But we're going to be focusing solely on Blender throughout this entire course.